It's a beautiful day in this neighborhood. A beautiful day for a neighbor. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? It's a neighborly day in this beauty wood. A neighborly day for a beauty. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? I have always wanted to have a neighbor just like you. I have always wanted to live in a neighborhood with you. So let's make the most of this beautiful day. Since we're together, we might as well say, would you be mine? Could you be mine? Won't you be my neighbor? Won't you please? Won't you please? Please won't you be my neighbor? Listen, many kids wanted to be Mr. Rogers' neighbor. I was one of those kids. I kind of didn't like Mr. Rogers all that much, but I did want to be his neighbor. For a half an hour each day, Mr. Rogers would walk us through his neighborhood, teaching us lessons, introducing us to his friends on what, and he taught us what it meant to be a good neighbor and to love our neighbor and to help our neighbors. Well, 2,000 years before Fred Rogers came on the scene, Jesus taught us what it means to love our neighbor. But the question is, what does it mean to love our neighbor? Now, we can make it really complicated and overlook the people who are closest to us, like our actual neighbors, and end up going overseas or around the block. And those are neighbors too. But I want us to zero in on our actual neighbors, people who live across the street from us and people who live next door to us. Have you ever thought that God placed you in your neighborhood to love and serve your neighbors? But how do we do that? How do we do that? And well, that's what this series is all about. How do we practice the art of neighboring? So let me ask, when was the last time you had an interaction with your neighbors? Was it yesterday? Maybe it was a week ago. How about a month ago? Maybe for some, it was a year ago. Or others, and no judgment here, maybe you've never interacted with your neighbors. Well, according to a recent survey, that is a growing trend where people simply don't have interaction with their neighbors. Listen, a third of Americans say they've never interacted with their neighbors. Again, this is a no judgment zone, a no condemnation zone. This is just simply reality. Again, this is the complete opposite of the way it used to be. Now, according to more research done about 40 years ago, over a third of Americans said that they hung out with their neighbors at least twice a week. Something has changed. Something has happened where that is no longer the case. Well, our author, Mark Dunkelman, actually helps us. In his book, The Vanishing Neighbor, he says there used to be a necessity to reach out and build bonds with people who lived nearby. Well, his reasoning is his reasoning for the decline is limited social capital. In other words, time and attention. And now we have more ways to spend our time and we have more ways to spend our attention, so it distracts us from our neighbors. Dunkelman says that this is tragic because we talk less with people who have different opinions. This is what he says. In those everyday interactions that you would have, you might not necessarily be convinced that you were right, but you'd begin to understand that your neighbors or others you disagreed with had a legitimate point of view. Dunkelman added, listen, from the 1920s to the 1960s, there was this sort of cohort effect in which people were more inclined, in many cases, to find security that existed in neighborhoods. Listen, 40 years ago, neighbors depended on one another much more. Again, more data. A survey reveals that nearly 1 in 4 people are living somewhere with no sense of community spirit in their neighborhood. Well, friends, that's the reason we're doing this series, to help us all to practice the art of neighboring Jesus style. And so over the next several weeks, we're going to explore what it means to restore the art of neighboring in this series, Won't You Be My Neighbor? Now, some of you you're already doing this. You know your neighbors and you interact with your neighbors and you have cookouts together, you have parties together, and we say, man, that is so amazing. And we're saying we want more of that, especially in this time. And individuals who are doing that, you can actually share your best practices with the rest of us who may not be so adept at actually practicing the art of neighboring. So in Mark chapter 12, if you have a copy of the scriptures, Mark chapter 12, verses 28 through 34, Jesus actually gives us the foundation of the art of neighboring. And so here are the learning objectives for today. At the end of this message, we hope, this is what I hope, that you will be able to explain the why behind, or the what is the foundation of loving our neighbors. Number 2, identify who our neighbors are, and then begin intentionally building a relationship with our neighbors. So turn to Mark chapter 12, verse 28 through 34. And the passages that we'll cover, they will be on the screen as well. So here's the foundation for loving our neighbor. So there was a scribe, and this is what it says, verse 28, and one of the scribes came up and heard them disputing. Them is Jesus and the Sadducees. So Jesus and the Sadducees are having a debate and a conversation, and a scribe comes up and he hears the debate. And seeing that Jesus had answered them well, the scribe now asked Jesus a question. And that question is, which commandment is the most important of all? So a scribe, a teacher, an interpreter of the law, overheard Jesus debating with the Sadducees and saw an opportunity to ask a serious question. Well, Matthew gives us a little bit more information and says, actually, Jesus, the scribe asked the question to test and trap Jesus. So the debate is about this debate about the greatest command wasn't a new debate. It was kind of like you and I arguing over who is the greatest football player, or who is the greatest musician, or who is the greatest basketball player to ever play the game. The religious-minded person would actually continue to debate this issue. What is the greatest commandment? Now, the rabbinic tradition had isolated 613 commands in the first 5 books of the Bible called the Torah. 365 were negative and 248 were positive. Some were considered light, that is, making less demands, while others were viewed as heavy demands with severe repercussions for disobeying those commands. And so Jesus' answer takes us to the core of what really matters in life and what is of supreme importance. So the question is, what is the foundation of loving our neighbor? Well, the foundation of loving our neighbor is loving God. Loving God is the foundation. So Jesus says in this passage, and we're going to look at it, love God supremely. Love God supremely. And so this is what Jesus says in verse 29. Jesus answered, the most important is, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. And so Jesus begins by quoting what Israel calls the Shema. And that's found in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 through 5. And this is what it says. Hear, O Israel. Sounds familiar, right? Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. And so Jesus begins with loving God supremely is the foundation of loving our neighbor. So loving God actually precedes loving our neighbor. And so what does it mean to love God supremely? Well, Jesus actually tells us, love God, number one, love God for who he is. Love God for who he is. So let me go back to verse 29. The most important one, answered Jesus, is this. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You see, every devout Jew recited this every morning and evening. That is the Shema. So let me say a couple of things about this verse. The first sentence, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Here is the heart and soul of the Hebrew and the Christian faith. It's the heart and soul of the Christian faith and the Hebrew faith. So this would have been a powerful confession of the uniqueness and the exclusivity of God. This would have been very significant for Mark's mostly non-Jewish audience, who had been saved and delivered from worshiping many gods, what we call polytheism, by the one. And so they were delivered and saved by the one and only God through Jesus Christ. You see, in the pagan world, gods, that is the world where they did not worship one God, gods occupied a particular domain. For instance, if you were about to take a voyage, then you would pray to the god Neptune, and you wanted Neptune on board with you. Why? Because Neptune was the god of the sea. Now, if I was Greek and I'm about to make a speech, I'm preaching, and again, if I was a polytheistic person, what I would do, I would call on Hermes, that's the Greek god, and his name, in the Latin name would have been Mercury. I would call on that god to help me because they were the gods, that was the god of communication. If we were about to go to war, we would call on Zeus, his Greek name, Jupiter, the Latin name, because Zeus was the god of war. If I wanted to meet somebody and fall in love with somebody, or if my love was waning with Tanya and I wanted to get a jump start in my love, I would call on Venus, because I would call on Venus and Cupid actually, and because they would help me to love better. They would help me to fall in love with another person. And so each god, had a particular domain, and you wanted to have that God with you when you were going into that domain. So you know what this meant? This meant you could never give your complete allegiance and devotion and love and worship to one God. You actually had to split your allegiance and worship between all these other gods. And that's the reason the Shema starts off that God is one and you should worship him and him alone. Your allegiance should not be distracted, but given directly to him. So Jesus begins his answer with a powerful declaration. God is not a God of some narrow domain. He made every single domain. He wants us to recognize him as the master and the ruler and the only sovereign Lord over every single domain. He is Lord of the domain of work, and he's the Lord of the domain of play and career and family and marriage and money. He is exclusively Lord over all, and he desires us to give him exclusive devotion, allegiance, and worship. So Jesus begins this conversation with the scribe and says, hey, I want you to recognize that God is Lord over all the world, and he has no real rivals. This is not open for debate. He created us and delivered us through his son, Jesus. This is God and God alone, and we should worship him for who he is, because he is Lord alone and Lord over all. Jesus actually continues with the Shema in talking to the scribe. He says, here's what I want you, not only love God for who he is, but I want you to love God with all you are, or all we are. So loving God supremely means loving God for who he is, but also loving God with all we are. And he says, and you shall, verse 30, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. We should not only worship him for who he is, we should worship him for all we are, with all we are. Love the Lord your God personal, with all your heart, with all your soul, with your entire mind, and with your entire and all your strength. Now, I could break down each one of these and talk extensively about each one, but I think we would I would spend time repeating myself, and because there's a lot of overlap. So what does this mean? Well, first, what Jesus means here is that our love for God is a matter of the heart and not duty and ritual. Let me say that again. Because when he says, I want you to love God with your every, that's the literal Greek. I want you to love God with your every. That is, this is not a matter of ritual. This is not a matter of duty. This is all that I am, prizes God as the one and only God. This love includes the totality of our being, every aspect of our lives, with our family, the way we love our family, the way we spend our money, literally everything. What we think about is a way to love God. And we talk about love. Now, we're not talking about this flimsy concept of love that we see in our world today, quitting when life gets tough and warm, fuzzy feelings. No, the love that Jesus is talking about here, it prizes God above everything, and it cherishes God above all others. He gets first place in my life, in your life. It's a love that invites him into every decision that we make. It's a love that responds to his overtures. It's a love that says, hey, come away with me so that I can speak with you. Come away with me so I can tell you amazing things. Come away with me so I can tell you how much I love you. Even in the midst of a pandemic, I want you to know that I am with you. But we'll never know that if we don't take time to come away with the one that loves us. Pastor Sam Storms, he points out a beautiful analogy of how a man loves his wife, and I would dare say a wife loves her husband, and gives insight into his love or her love for God. He puts them into a series of questions, and here are some of those questions. Is the Lord the all-consuming passion of my life? Do I have a deep, intense, and abiding affection for the Lord? Am I loyal to my God with an exclusive love? There are no rivals. Do I resist or even oppose anything that seeks to do my Lord harm? Am I zealous to, with grace, defend my Lord's name and honor? Do I enjoy spending time with my Lord? Do I do things that please him and increase my joy? Do I brag about my Lord to others? Do I tell my Lord that I love him? And do I talk with my Lord as much as I can? I think those are some very, very powerful questions. Convicted me even as I read through them, as I was preparing. Do I treat God that way? Again, this is a no judgment zone, a no condemnation zone. We all have room to grow, right? But I think this is part of loving God with our everything. You say, wait a minute, Marvin, like you mean to tell me like every day? Yeah, absolutely every day. With all of my decisions, yeah, that's part of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. Again, remember, these are not things to get God to love me. These are things that I do because God loves me and because I love him. We don't love, obey, and worship God to get him to love us. We love him because he first loved us. In other words, he created capacity in us to love him. Well, is this a message about neighboring? Absolutely. Remember, this is laying the foundation. It begins with loving God and loving him for who he is and loving him with all that we are. Now, again, this is not just suck it up love and do it even when you don't feel like it. Neither is this the kind of love that's reduced to mere emotion. This loving God thing means so much more. And, the surrounding context of Deuteronomy, where the Shema is, gives us a clue what it means to love God. That means to obey his commands with all that I am, to fear and reverence God with all that I am. And passing on, listen, this is an interesting one, passing on God's commands to the next generation with all that I am. So the foundation for loving my neighbor is to love God and love him supremely. What does it mean to love God supremely? It means to love God for who he is. He is one. And he is the Lord over every domain. And not only that, love him with all that I am. So not only are we to love God supremely for who he is and all we are also to do something else. That is love our neighbor. Loving our neighbor. So love our neighbors genuinely. We are to love God supremely, but we're to love our neighbors genuinely. Listen to the verses 31 and 32. The second is this: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. Notice Jesus says commandment, not commandments. He says these two hang together. And the scribe said to him, "You are right, teacher. You have truly said that he is one and there is no other beside him." Jesus says we are to love our neighbors or love people genuinely. So what Jesus does here, he connects the first command with the second command, and that second command is found in Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the sons of your own people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. So Jesus gives the scribe more than he asked for. He wants to know the greatest commandment. Jesus responds by telling him that there are two great commandments, loving God and loving your neighbor, and they hang together. They are Siamese twins that should never be separated. Why? Because how we respond to the first, loving God, will determine how we respond to the second, loving our neighbor. These commands are twins that should, again, never be separated. The common denominator for both of these commands is loving God, is love. That is, love God and love our neighbor. The common denominator is love. Love God and love neighbor. You see, growing out of our love for God is our love for those who have been created in the image of God, and that includes our neighbors. Now, when Jesus talks about neighbors, and when Leviticus chapter 19 and verse 18 talks about neighbors, the word actually means the near ones. That's pretty clear. Like those who are nearest to us. And those who are nearest to us are our family members. And yes, those who live in front of us, behind us, and on either side of us. Now, I know there are people like you live out in the rural area and your neighbor lives like a block, 2 blocks from you. I understand that. But they're still considered your neighbors. Now, neighbors can be used in the broadest sense. Anyone we come in contact with who has a need, that is the Good Samaritan in Luke chapter 10, that becomes our neighbor. Absolutely, that is true. But sometimes I think we miss the obvious, that is the people who are living next door to us. I would prefer, this is me, right? I would prefer to go across the sea and talk to my neighbors over in Kenya than to talk to my neighbors across the street. Because it's so much easier that way. And yet the obvious part here is to love those who are near, people who are physically nearest to us. So I love what G.K. Chesterton said, we make our friends, we make our enemies, but God makes our neighbor because he or she is there. The nearness of our neighbor is providential, as God never gets the address wrong, close quote. So you and I live where we live today. I know you bought the home and I bought the home where I live, but guess what? In the grand scheme of things, in the sovereignty of God, God placed you next to the people that he placed you next to in your neighborhood. I hear some of you say, well, God, why'd you have to place me next to people who play their music loud? Or why do you have to place me next to someone who cusses all the time? Oh, God, why'd you have to place me next to that neighbor? Yeah, I get it. I understand. And yet in the providence of God, God says, I want you to understand a theology of place. I've placed you right there so that you can be light and salt to the people who are nearest you. So again, when Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself, that love your neighbor as yourself piece, he's not talking about a narcissistic love of ourselves. He is actually saying that we will serve the needs of others with all the energy and passion and zeal with which we meet our own needs. So this is possible only if we have understood the first command, love God. When I love God supremely, I will be able to love my neighbors genuinely. If I don't love others genuinely, love my neighbors genuinely and passionately, it is probably a commentary on the status of my love for God. So here's another point. To love God is to love others. To love God is to love my neighbor. So let me give you a couple of verses. Let no one seek his own good, but the good of his neighbor. That's 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 24. Here's another verse, Galatians chapter 5, verse 14. For the whole law is fulfilled in one word, love. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. So when Paul says that, he's automatically connecting it with loving God. So when he says love your neighbor as yourself, he is assuming that you're loving God. This is 1 John chapter 3, verse 14 and 18. It says, we know that we have passed out of death into life because we love the brothers. Whoever does not love abides in death. Verse 18, little children, let us not love in word or talk, but in deed and in truth. 1 John 4, verse 12, no one has ever seen God. If we love one another, God abides in us, and his love is perfected in us. You see, when we examine the context of Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18, we discover loving our neighbor means a lot. Among other things, it means this: care for the poor, do not steal, do not lie, be fair in business dealings with your neighbor, care for the deaf, care for the blind, deal justly with all, avoid slandering your neighbor, do not jeopardize the life of your neighbor, do not hate your neighbor in your heart. Also rebuke your neighbor when necessary for his and or her own good, and do not take revenge or bear a grudge against your neighbor. You see, the greatest demonstration of our love for God, people, is our love for our neighbor. If I tell you that I love God, and then if I tell you that I love God, then the first place you should look is not how many verses that I've read and how many prayers I've prayed, how many sermons I've preached, or how many songs I've sung. The first place you and I should look is to see how we're interacting with people. The people who are closest to us, the people in my immediate sphere of influence. How I treat people, how I treat my neighbors is a litmus test of my love for God. So loving God and my neighbor is a matter of heart devotion, not religious duty. So what does this mean for me and you? So number one, embrace the theology of place. Embrace the theology of place. Now, what does that mean, Marvin? Well, as I mentioned earlier, that God had, this blew my mind when I understood this. Understand that God places people in neighborhoods, in communities, for the purpose of their neighbors. That is, he places his followers in certain neighborhoods, in certain regions, in certain communities, so that we might be salt and light in those neighborhoods, so that we might do good in those neighborhoods, so that we might pray for those neighborhoods, so that we might pray for our neighbors, so that we might actually, when life happens in those neighborhoods, we would be first responders, demonstrating how much we love God and how much we love them. Now listen, this is not getting a notch on your belt, an evangelistic notch on your belt. This is just about being a good neighbor, loving people right where they are, not trying to get them to believe something first. No, that's not it. It's just, here, you can borrow my saw, you can borrow my ladder. Hey, can I bring you something to eat? I heard you were sick. And this is just simply being a good neighbor. Sharing the gospel is our ultimate motive, not our ulterior motive. Let me say that again. Sharing the gospel is our ultimate motive, not an ulterior motive. So embrace the theology of place. That God has us where we are right now, because that's where he wants us to be. He has me where I am now, because that's where he wants me to be now. So that's the first, embrace the theology of place. The second application to this is get to know your neighbors. Get to know your neighbors. Some of you already do that. You walk and you know your neighbors, you know who they are. Get to know their names and get to know their occupation. Get to know what they care about, and get to know what's happening in their life. This is not being nosy. It's just being concerned about your and my neighbors. Now, Tanya and I, we walk through our neighborhood, and at times when we're walking and we see neighbors out there, some of you do this as well. Like, listen, I'm trying to get my walk in. I don't want to talk to anybody. Listen, I have a goal to match and to meet. That is, I got to get my 10,000 steps in. And yet, inevitably, what happens, right? You're walking and your neighbor stops you. And you have a choice to make at that point. Do I act like I don't want to talk to them and kind of give them the signal, hey, how you doing? Or do I say, you know something, this is a divine appointment. I'm going to stop and I'm going to listen and I'm going to be present and I'm going to actually listen because my neighbor has something that God may want me to have that day. So get to know your neighbor. So I'm going to give you a quiz. All right, I'm going to give you a quiz and you're going to see this image on the screen. And again, this is a no judgment zone. This is a no condemnation zone. I'm going to give you a quiz, and we're going to return to this quiz later in the year. I want to know how well we know our neighbors. If we can put that image on the screen. And so this is a block map, or this is Do You Know Your Neighbor quiz. So look at your house as in the middle, right? And then on either side of you, you have people in front of you, behind you, on the side of you, kitty corner to you. And what I want you to do, again, don't feel any shame, don't feel any judgment. I want you to begin filling in the map of the name of your neighbor, the occupation of your neighbor, something that your neighbor enjoys, and something that your neighbor cares about. All right? Again, so some of you say, well, I don't know if I want to do that. Well, this is what we're after, the art of neighboring, because loving your neighbor actually begins with knowing your neighbor's name. Wow. Yeah, when one of the deepest levels of love is when you know a person's name and you're able to have a conversation with, not, hey, you, or hey, neighbor, to, hey, Mike, hey, Missy. Missy lives right across the street from us. We have Missy across the street from us. We have the Bradleys, kitty corner to us. And then we have Mr. Estruth, who lives right next door to us. Mr. Shepherd lives down the street from us. And again, Tanya and I just said, man, we want to know our neighbors. So what we're doing now, we have a lot of new families that have moved into our neighborhood, and so we're updating. Tanya and I are the kind of the keepers of the updated list of everyone in the neighborhood, because man, we want to know how we can best serve and love our neighbors in this season. So that's it. If you go to info, the info page on the website, you'll find not only this block map, you can share it with others. You'll also find about 32 or 33 practical ways in which you can and we can love our neighbors in this season. So love God supremely, love our neighbors genuinely. And we began loving our neighbors by getting to know them and embracing a theology of place. All right, that's all I have today. And I'm going to bring Carolyn back on. Carolyn, back to you. Man, I am so excited about this series because I think God is going to do some very significant things in our lives personally, but also in our neighborhoods.
I totally agree, Marvin. It is exciting. And this whole year, we've had to stay close to home, right? So what an opportunity for us to build on that. And maybe you have gotten to know your neighbors a little bit over the course of 2020, or now is the time. What resonated with you, friends, from today's sermon? And what's one thing, not 10, just one, pick one thing, but that you can do this week. That's my challenge for you. What's one thing that you will do this week as a result? Not 10 things that you'll think about doing sometime in the future. One thing this week. Take time before you move on to the rest of your day to talk to the people that you're watching with, or text somebody in your small group. Challenge each other, encourage each other to not just hear it, but to put feet to your faith and take a step in doing so. I also want to remind you about that Better Together conversation Wednesday at 7 p.m. on the topic of facing anxiety, whether that's your own or coming alongside someone else, the same way that you're watching this gathering right now is a way that you can watch that. It'll be on all of our broadcast links, Facebook, YouTube, the live broadcast. That broadcast link will help you. And of course, if there's anything we've talked about this morning and you want to have more information, or it's middle of the week and you're not remembering, the one thing to remember, info.wearetrinity.com. It is all there. Oh, friends, have a wonderful week. You are loved. Take care.